Meantime, the city of Orleans, yeah, right here on the map, was being besieged by the English. And if the city fell, it would be a big blow to the king. Joanne said, "Send me to Orleans with your army. I can raise the siege." The king finally relented and did so. To this day, nobody has ever faulted him for it. Now, Joanne was no military innovator, but what she supplied for the French people was something they had not had. She supplied enthusiasm and patriotism that the French had not had before. So, she, with the army that the king had given her, went to Orleans. As long as she was leading, the French were victorious. Then an English arrow struck Joanne in the breast. She became weak and stabbed with pain and carried to the battlefield. But while away from the battle, she got the news her army was losing. She ignored her pain and got up, went around and rallied the troops, said, "Turn back." The troops turned from the retreat, turned back. She turned the tide of battle. When the battle was over, the siege of Orleans had been lifted. The English had been routed, and Orleans was free. This was the beginning. Joanne was to go on and win 3 other victories, and after she'd won her 4th battle, the king felt strong enough to go to Reims, as his ancestors had done, and be crowned. Until that time, Joanne would only refer to him as the Dauphin, not the king, because he hadn't been crowned, and other people referred to him as Dauphin also. That word in your book says to be pronounced Dauphin or Dauphine. Either pronunciation is right. The Dauphin is a word that the French used to describe their heir apparent, the next king in line, the crown prince. Anyway, he went to be crowned king, and after that, things went downhill for Joanne. If you go into detail, more detail in the book does, she insisted that now we can next go to Paris. The king felt like, "Hey, no, we'll get Paris, but we're not ready to take on Paris yet." No, she said, "Go to Paris." She argued with the king and his generals, none of whom wanted to go. The king finally relented. I mean, after all, she won in 4 victories and sent her to Paris. On the way, she was waylaid by the Burgundians, people loyal to the Duke of Burgundy, captured, and the Burgundians turned her over to the English. The king showed no interest in ransoming her or in negotiating for her release. She was put on trial, and I mean, you can read in detail the trial. There was a time when she completely recanted. There was a period where she confessed to witchcraft. But in the end, she renounced all of her confessions of witchcraft and said, "Yes, I really heard these voices. These voices came from these saints, and they told me what to do." So, in 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake for witchcraft. But she had no sooner died, but what some of the English cried out, "Oh, may God help us, we have burned a saint." Something about the way she died. For 2 years after she died, the King of France sat on his throne and did nothing. Then all of a sudden his interest caught fire. Thanks to Joanne, there was a feeling of patriotism that the French had not seen. Within 7 years after Joanne's death, the King of France had driven out the English everywhere except for a port town here called Calais. That was the last in English hands for another 100 years. In 1453, and again I've told you over that year, the same year that the Turks captured Constantinople, in 1453 the fighting stopped, never to resume. The English kings gave up trying to conquer France, and have given up on it this day. And the French were victorious. Charles went on to become an old man. Now, during the course of all this happening, King Charles had granted Joan's family the title of nobility and exempted her from taxes for 300 years. This was what nobles had the privilege. So the family, the Arc family, however, the father did not live long enough to enjoy the title. He died 2 years after Joanne did, most of her. But the mother lived to be an old woman. After about 20 years, the mother appealed to the king to ask the Pope to try Joanne's case. So the Pope had the authority to overturn the decisions against Joanne for witchcraft. So he said to the king, ask the Pope to overturn. So the king sent a letter to the Pope. Now keep in mind, popes usually only lasted 4 or 5 years. Most of them were up in years, and life in those days was short. Keep that in mind because we're going to be talking about the popes in the next story. Anyway, the Pope of that day overturned all the decisions made by all the clerics who were now deceased. That still did not completely exonerate Joanne, because there were still some clerics who were alive, and their decisions against Joanne still stood. Well, that pope died. So the king, still Charles VII, who lived to be an old man, by the way, Charles VII appealed to the new pope to try Joanne's case again. By this time, all the clerics who had condemned Joanne were deceased. The new pope exonerated Joanne of all charges against her. And the mother was quite happy, because this meant that the new pope declared that Joanne was now in heaven. She was not declared a saint, however, until later. In 1920, when World War I ended, the church needed someone to rally around to unite. So in 1920, the Pope of that day declared Joan of Arc to be a saint. So today she's called Saint Joan of Arc. Her day is May 30th, which used to be Memorial Day before President Nixon changed it to the last Monday in May. But when I was a kid, we used to get off school May 30th, the day to remember the dead. May 30th is her day. And she has been declared a saint by the Catholic Church officially. She's cleared of all charges of witchcraft. All right. Having said that much, I'll pause. Any of you have any questions, any comments? Folks, for all the time I spent talking about Joanne, of course I know that most of you turned in papers. I have never had one student write a paper about Joan of Arc, and somehow female students tend to want to write about women.
You said you didn't want us to do that.
Well, no, I didn't. I don't think I actually said that. I mean, I said that a lot of females do write about women, but somehow none of you have ever written about Joan of Arc. And believe it or not, in a few days you'll be probably seeing Joanne's name on the test, because after all, I spent quite a bit of class time talking about her. And I'm surprised at how many students can't remember hardly anything I said about her. Now, hey, you know, the story, again, has an otherworldly character to it. Now, if you research it, and I have researched her extensively on the web, including just before class this morning, I got here fairly early. At one point, some of the web pages, you see, will direct you to a witchcraft web page. Not that I in any way advocate that, but the witches do in fact claim that Joanne and her protector, her protector was eventually burned for being a wizard also.
It was a male protector?
There was a male protector, yeah, on the battlefield. Yeah, a guy, something or other, Guy Puins, I believe. He was a nobleman protector. He was eventually burned for witchcraft. But the witches claimed that she was one of them. Be that as it may, people down through the general consensus today is that she was a good woman. She has been called the first modern woman, a woman who defied the authorities. And something else she said, that was, she died about 50 years before Martin Luther was born. But some of what she said was to be repeated, perhaps unknowing by Martin Luther, who came later, that each individual should interpret Scripture for himself, and it was not up to the church to interpret. This was considered heresy at the time, now, folks. Martin Luther, by the way, was to say the same thing. But she believed that the church did not have the power, the authority to interpret and explain that each individual did, and for this she was condemned as a heretic. Again, she lived 50 years before Luther. She was a very independent-minded woman. I must say two things about her that haven't. Number one, she was a transvestite or cross-dresser. She insisted on dressing in boys' clothes instead of dressing like a woman. And she was extremely domineering, to the point where she even told the king and the top generals in his army what to do. And that may have explained why that the king did not try to rescue her or did not negotiate a release when she's captured. The king felt like, as long as she's around, I'm not king. As long as she was more popular than the king by far. And the king might have felt like, now that she's gone, I can now become king again. And he's remembered as Charles VII the Victorious, but he has this one blot on his name. He's called Victorious because during his reign, he drove the enemy out, something his ancestors for several generations had not been able to do. You might think he would get a high name, and also France prospered largely under his reign, but he always has this blight against him. He did not do anything to save the person who had saved him. And I think a lot of the reason was she was his boss. Now, some men are just naturally henpecked. And this king was one of them. If you look closely at this king's personal life, he later had a mistress who wound up controlling and dominating him even perhaps worse than Joanne had. Again, some men are just simply prone to being henpecked, controlled, dominated by women. And some women are prone to dominate. She was one of them. Again, each of you can make up your mind for yourself what you actually believe about Joanne. And recently, I mean, they had an article on MSN about untimely deaths of young people. And the article went all the way back to 1431 to Joan of Arc. That she was a young woman, about 21 years old when she was burned at the stake. They had Elvis Presley, you know, a young actor, you know, a young singer, an actor too, who died at 41. And they were talking about other famous persons for the last 300 or 400 years who had died young. Edgar Allan Poe, who only lived about 41 years. And Joanne was the last one mentioned because she was the one where they started from. Famous persons who died before their time. All right. Anybody else? Okay. Now,
When you said she died in 1431?
1431, yeah, 1431. About 22 years before the last fighting, but by 1438, the King of France had eventually got the Duke of Burgundy, who had captured Joanne in the first place, the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Lorraine on his side. And, well, the King of France, I mean, he was an intelligent man. He would pick his fights. He was good at that. He'd pick a fight that he thought he could more easily win at and get a duke on his side. He'd pick another fight, win out and get a duke on his side. By 1431, he had the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Lorraine on his side. And once he had those two dukes on his side, the English might as well have gone home. And in 1453, they did just that. They simply quit fighting. High school history books said a more needless war had hardly ever been fought, but this was to lead to wars between England and France that runs like a scarlet thread throughout the history of the two countries. And they finally stopped fighting each other during the Napoleonic Wars, when, again, England with a smaller population defeated the French under Napoleon, and part of it was due to Napoleon's own stupidity. And then the two sides became allies. They fought side by side during both world wars. Well, France did not do much fighting in World War II. They were knocked out of the war early, but they at least were on our same side. And I did have a student write a paper now about the French, said the French have had a terrible time winning wars in recent years, in recent centuries. Only luck, thanks to Joan of Arc coming on the scene, were able to win a 100 Years' War. But other than that, they lost the Franco-Prussian War, and then in World War II, the first battle they fought, they got knocked out of the war, battle number 1. And it was a very, very terrible, they've had a very, very terrible time in their wars. Now, they did win one war now. They came to help the United States fight for its independence against Britain.